Thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of the Natural State Podcast. This time, I bring back Brad Marshall for round 2 of digging into linoleic acid and why it is so bad for you. So the first one, we dove into food sources of linoleic acid and how it affects you on the mitochondrial level. Very deep episode. Asked you guys for feedback, and there was a lot of positive stuff, so decided to bring Brad back for a round 2. What happens is, after this metabolism gets screwed up, you actually have a lot of pathological things happening inside your body that keep you, even if you limit linoleic acid, vegetable oils, all of those nasty fats, you can have your body switch all your saturated fat into unsaturated fat. That leads to the same problem as actually eating vegetable oils and seed oils. So it's a gnarly process driven by this enzyme called SCD1. So Brad dives a lot into that, how you can stop it, how you can get back to a point where you're actually burning your own fat instead of hibernating like a winter animal. So this one, again, is action-packed, very in-depth, but I'd say really focused for people who are curious about how to lose fat in an effective way, but also keep it off. So we dive into a lot of different things around why certain diets may work in the short term, but fail in the long term. And Brad started with that for a long period of his life. And so we get there again. So tune into this one. I hope you guys enjoy. I hope it is not as overwhelming as the first one was for a little while. But Brad is a super intelligent guy and gets in some really nitty-gritty details. So get a pen and paper and enjoy this one. This episode is brought to you by Element, or LMNT, which is an electrolyte beverage brand founded by Rob Wolf, Luis Villasenor, and Tyler Cartwright. 2 of 3 of those guys have actually been on the show to talk about why they started this company and their background in this space. But mainly they have worked with literally thousands of people. And these are some of the most qualified experts that I learned a lot from in the early days of when I was doing keto and helping research and help a lot of people. And the number one thing that these guys saw was that people were having an extremely hard time switching to low carb because they were simply not getting enough electrolytes. But as you guys know, I often complain about the supplement industry is full of absolute trash, that people using artificial ingredients, fillers, sugar, etc. And they could not find an electrolyte that met their standards, not only from lack of ingredients, but not having the highest amount of sodium, potassium, and magnesium that they thought needed to exist in certain ratios. So they launched Element, and I drink them myself daily. So I've been a long time user basically since the first day they launched. And whenever I go back to eating keto or lower carb after eating moderate amount of carbs, I need these things at least a couple times a day, or else I feel like crap, especially in the summertime here in Austin, Texas, where it's 150 degrees every single day. And I'm working out outside, playing basketball, hanging out with friends, and sweating my face off. I typically have up to 4 of these in a day. My favorite is the citrus salt, which is the original one, but the raspberry and habanero are also my favorites as well. So if you guys want to hear more about Element and my favorites and why I use it, head on over to drinklmnt.com/TNSP. That's drinklmnt.com/TNSP. Brad, thank you for joining me yet again. Here we are.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for having me back.
We left off where you were going up to check on the pigs.
That's right. Yes. It's been eventful. We have started, I've spent like the last 4 weeks shipping Firebrand Meats shares. I mean, I have a company who does it, but coordinating with them. And so it's been an exciting week because I finally, I've been talking about this forever, and I finally have product in the freezer and it's shipping to people. And now I'm like, now I have these 400 orders that I've taken over time, and I'm trying to make sure that everyone gets the thing and gets it at the right time and they're not on vacation. And so it's a little bit of a, I joke about it and say like, I do pre-orders because I hate myself, but really I do pre-orders because I need the money to get the product made. But it is a bit of it's a little bit of a gets me. I have to like get just making sure all the threads get taken care of. So it's a little crazy, but good news is, the port is really good. People who have gotten it love it. It's shipping. It's in stock. You can buy it at firebrandmeats.com right now. And I actually just redid the website this morning and added some new products and stuff on there.
Nice.
So just different combo packs detox and stuff. So
good timing. Did you get the new results of the fatty acid composition from the first round? Have you seen any changes?
I didn't. I have not gotten those results yet. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let me know when you do, and I'll put it over my social media and people can check it out.
Totally. That's awesome.
Cool. So we left off last time. It was got some really good feedback on the episode. So I'm glad people sort of sent me some messages. We went in depth and have some questions for sure to clear up, but looking like a continuation of last time. So this is like a very, very brief overview. Talked a lot about the food system and why it's screwed up, and how when you eat specially refined seed oils, quote unquote vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, all the way to pork, chicken, etc., they have a lot of this polyunsaturated fatty acid, linoleic acid. This is kind of the specific reason why we theorize that, or also Peter and some of these other guys who have done a lot of the crazy work here, but this stuff goes into the mitochondria, screws up the way you produce reactive oxygen species. You don't have enough. This screws up signaling in the fat cells. The fat cells become too full. They start spewing all over the place and bursting. This leads to insulin resistance. I think it's a kind of a fair a fair summary of the 3-hour journey we were on last time?
Yeah, I mean, I might jump in here and say that, and so that actually, so this discussion kind of brings, well, that like the process you were just describing brings me into a lot of the research I've been doing lately, which is, and I think it'd be good to lead the show off with this, is this idea of, as I mentioned to you before we went live, is this idea of something called torpor. And so what's really interesting about all of this is that, okay, so when you look at an animal who wants to hibernate, an animal who wants to store fat and slow down their metabolic rate, what do? They start eating linoleic acid. So you
see this in acorns in the fall and all this type of stuff. It's like
right.
Naturally shift over to this for most mammals.
Right. And so I recently did a post about this paper that came out, and what they did was they took two groups of hibernating ground squirrels, and they fed one group like 1.5% linoleic acid by weight. That's roughly, because the way they described the diets in the paper wasn't very specific. And another group got what I think was around 8% linoleic acid. And so they fed them on this diet for a couple of months, and then they turned down the temperature to around 40 degrees, which is to trigger, right, the onset of winter. Okay, it just got cold, winter's coming. This is what the squirrels are thinking. And then they fasted them because the squirrels stop eating as winter approaches and they go into hibernation. And what happened is the squirrels that only got 1.5% linoleic acid, they actually failed to go into torpor, and then they failed to hibernate. So the 4 that got 8% linoleic acid by weight, it got cold, the food went away, no problem. They went right to sleep. They kept all their body fat stores, made it through winter just fine, presumably. Actually, they did make it through the, the artificial winter just fine. The other 4 squirrels that only had 1% linoleic acid, they burned off all of their body fat in about 9 days of fasting, because they failed to get torpid, is the literal term of these hibernating animals. And so what happens is, for whatever reason, this is how we all presumably are evolved to behave, is that I believe that your metabolic rate is tightly tied to how saturated your fat is. And so I think that, and specifically what I mean by that is how saturated the fat entering your mitochondria is. And so the fat entering your mitochondria is always a blend of your dietary fat and your stored body fat.
Last time we talked about basically the one half of that, which is when you're taking in dietary saturated fat, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, where those come from and why that's a bad idea. But there's a whole other side of this equation that when you stop eating, and even when you are eating throughout the day, you're also breaking down your own fatty acids and fat stores. And then those also go in the mitochondria.
Right. Exactly. And so anyway, and so what happens with these animals that need to hibernate is the linoleic acid is the trigger to get into this torpor. But if you eat enough linoleic acid, what happens is you upregulate. That's when you upregulate this enzyme called SCD1. And what SCD1 does is it starts converting all of your stored saturated fat into monounsaturated fats. And so what you see is an animal that is successful at hibernation will probably have high amounts of linoleic acid and the monounsaturated fats, oleic acid and palmitoleic acid, and very low levels of stearic acid in their stored fat. And that is the state that allows them to go into this alternate metabolic mode of torpor. And that allows them to do things like lower their body temperature, to lower their metabolic rate, and to just hold on to their stores of body fat, right? And it's literally an alternate metabolic pathway, and it lets them store their fat for the whole winter. And like I say, the squirrels that didn't become torpid lost all their body fat in about a week.
So when you eat a lot of linoleic acid, we obviously talked about everything from last episode about the reactive oxygen species and that leading to this insulin sensitivity to the fat cell. But also what happens is this increase in SCD1.
Right.
SCD1, the D in there is desaturates. So it desaturates saturated fat that you have, turns it into monounsaturated fat, which then goes back into the mitochondria.
Right.
To do the same thing that we talked about before, which leads again to insulin signaling at the fat cell. So it's like an internal feedback loop that keeps running. So basically, if you're eating linoleic acid all the time, you as a human, as a mammal, are in essentially a hibernating state.
Right. And so then just to add to that discussion and bring it back to humans. So if you look at the other article that I just wrote on my blog, and so it's very fresh in my mind, but it's a really good paper. If you look at the desaturase index, which is an indirect indicator of SCD1 levels, but it's basically how much monounsaturated fat versus how much saturated fat you have. And if you look at that number in very obese people, it is very high. And so there's this very strong and direct correlation between your BMI, your body mass index, which is also to say sort of how obese you are, and your desaturase index. And so in this paper, they showed that. But then what they also did, and this was fascinating, so they took a muscle biopsy from lean people and from very obese people, and they actually grew it in a tissue culture. And the muscle tissue from the lean people compared to the muscle tissue from the obese people, that muscle tissue burned a lot more fat in the lean people. Like it had a much higher rate of fat oxidation, and it was not very prone to storing fat. Whereas if you looked at the muscle tissue of the obese people, it was not burning much fat, and it was storing a lot of fat. It was making a lot of fat. It was doing de novo lipogenesis, which just means fat making, literally. And then what they did was they took the muscle tissue from the lean people and they overexpressed SCD1. So all they did was increase this one enzyme, which converts saturated fats from monounsaturated fats. And that one change was enough to make the fat tissue from the lean people behave exactly like the fat tissue from obese people, which is to say that it decreased fat oxidation rates, it increased the amount of fat that was being stored, and it increased the amount that muscle tissue was making its own fat through the process of de novo lipogenesis. And so, this SCD1 is a really important, I think, metabolic switch that's controlling, it's doing it all indirectly, I think, via its effect on how saturated the fat is in any given tissue. So in any given tissue, if you can turn on this gene, it just wipes out all of the stearic acid. It just lowers all the saturated fats, and it brings in all these unsaturated fats. And again, like we talked about before, that affects this whole process in the mitochondria and how much ROS is being driven. And it ties in with leptin signaling and this whole thing. And so anyways, so I think we can say, at least according to this one paper, that having too much unsaturated fat in your muscle tissue causes it to stop burning fat and start storing fat, and that is often triggered by eating a lot of linoleic acid. But then if you do enough of that, now you upregulate this other enzyme, SCD1, and now you're like permanently in unsaturated mode, and you're not burning fat, and you're more prone to storing fat.
Right. So I think there's a couple things to unpack here. One would be, we'll just start with, what are the things that upregulate SCD1? So again, just as a reminder, upregulate SCD1 changes your own fats from saturated to unsaturated, and that creates less reactive oxygen species, makes the fat cell stay open, all these things that we talked about last time. So what are the things other than eating lots of linoleic acid lead to upregulated SCD1?
Well, I mean, the other really big one is if you eat a lot of sugar. And so that's an interesting one because, right, it ties together this idea of like, oh, we're eating too much vegetable oil and we're eating too much sugar. And both of those things massively upregulate SCD1. And so
is there any types or an amounts that you've seen? Like what's
so the amount that there in a mouse model, right? In a rodent model, if they give mice a diet that's like, it's a really high percentage of sugar. It's like 80 or 90% by sugar. Their SCD1 levels go up like tenfold. So we're talking like a massive increase, and those mice do become obese. And in my blog, I talk about an anecdote with Native Americans. And there was a guy, he was actually he was sort of taken hostage during the French Indian War by Native Americans. And he it's actually a cool story. They made him a member of their tribe, and he lived with the Native Americans for like 5 years as one of them. And so he has all these stories about what they ate. But anyways, there's an anecdote where they say, one of the things the Native Americans would eat is they would make this sauce that was basically half bear grease and half maple sugar, because they made a lot of maple sugar, and they would roast venison and they would dip it into this sauce that they had.
Sounds delicious.
No, delicious, right? And they would literally, that was literally their staple for like 3 months of the year. But the other comment is there were some Native Americans that were so fond of the maple sugar that that's all that they ate. And those were the only fat Native Americans that he had ever seen. And so
is that just due to the amount of insulin without any fat that it produces, or what's the sugar?
Well, I think it may be because it, if you eat just sugar, it massively upregulates SCD1. It's another way of perhaps getting into this torpor or this torpid metabolism, or whatever you want to call it. It's like, because there's a whole, I talk a lot about SCD1, but there's a whole bunch of enzymes that are upregulated along with SCD1. Usually SCD1 is like, it's very dynamic. So sometimes it behaves in ways that all the other enzymes don't go along with. But in addition to SCD1, usually what you see, there's a transcription factor called PPAR gamma. It kind of controls this whole response. You see upregulated genes involved in de novo lipogenesis. And so, which just means making new fat, literally. And so you see all these genes involved in making more fat, right? And so now when you're eating a carbohydrate food, your body, if you're making a lot of SCD1 and you have a lot of PPAR gamma and all these other enzymes, you're going to turn that into fat and you're going to store it as fat. And so that's the metabolic thing that's playing out, because again, my argument is that, why does torpor exist? Well, it exists so that mammals can hibernate, right? We evolved to have this warm-blooded metabolism that likes to burn. We like to do thermogenesis. I mean, that's the whole point of a warm-blooded metabolism, is you're burning extra fat to maintain your body temperature at a certain level, right? And so that takes a lot of calories, and it's all very tightly regulated. And if you're a mammal that lives in the north and there's no food in the winter, you have to figure out how to get through winter. And so you also have to have a mechanism to switch that off, right? You have to switch off that high metabolic rate, thermogenesis, all that stuff. And so, it seems like this is how we do it. We turn on, instead of, so animals that are lean and they're healthy and they're eating a lot of whatever starch, for instance, tend to run through PPAR alpha, which is like the alternative to PPAR gamma. So you have these two transcription factors, and what transcription factors do is they turn on and off other genes. And so PPAR gamma, which is what you're making a lot of if you have high levels of SCD1, it turns on all of the genes that convert calories into fat and that store calories as fat. And PPAR alpha, on the other hand, turns on genes involved in thermogenesis and in, making heat, right? And so there's literally, our body has choices about what to do with calories. It can either increase our body temperature, increase our metabolic rate and burn it off, or it can make fat and store it. And so I think SCD1 is, in this desaturase index, is an indicator that you're on the part of the metabolic spectrum where your biochemistry is set up to make and store more fat, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum where your biochemistry is set up to burn fat. Right. And SCD1 is interesting because it is the indicator that you're in that mode, but it also seems to be kind of the linchpin of it. One of the things that happens is the end products of SCD1 are things like oleic acid, which is a monounsaturated fat, and oleic acid actually increases PPAR gamma, and PPAR gamma increases SCD1, and SCD1 increases oleic acid, which increases PPAR gamma.
So there's all these loops. So I want to keep bringing it back to like thinking through. If somebody's listening to this podcast, they listen to the last one, they maybe are dealing with obesity issues their whole life or for a long period of time. And we talked about last time, okay, remove from your diet the linoleic acid and the vegetables for sure.
Right.
Get firebrand meats instead of your store-bought bacon, 100%. But that's not enough. And so, like you're saying, there's these positive feedback loops that keep switching over your cellular machinery to keep making these unsaturated fats, which then keep you in a state of torpor and keep you basically in this fat accumulation, fat storage mode instead of fat burning, thermogenic mode. So exactly. I know you've written some about certain populations also decreasing body temperature when introducing linoleic acid, et cetera. But for somebody who is listening to these podcasts and they remove the linoleic acid, now they have this loop going of SCD1, PPAR, gamma, all this stuff sort of running in the background on default.
Right.
What now? I mean, what's the difference between an animal that goes into hibernation, who flips the switch back on after winter, versus who stop eating? Is it just the amount of cascading that leads it into this quicksand, or what's the difference there?
Well, I mean, that's right. That's kind of the $1 million question. I mean, okay, so I'm arguing that we're in this alternative metabolic mode. How do we get back out of it? And the truth is, I don't know. And when you think about animals, it's like, well, so a lot of hibernating animals are fairly small, and small animals tend to have a very high metabolic rate compared to their body size. And so, a ground squirrel who goes into through the winter is going to burn off all of its fat, right? And in the spring, it's probably like a whole different. So like it has no fat stores now. So it's not fighting against this like huge reserve of linoleic acid and oleic acid anymore. It's like probably in a new metabolic state. And so then you're like, okay, well, something like a bear though, I'm not sure that bears even ever come out of this state, because bear fat is always pretty unsaturated, because that's a large animal, or a large, metabolic rate is all about how much surface area you have and how much heat you give off compared to how much mass you have, right? The surface area to mass volume ratio plays a huge role in your metabolic rate. And so I think for something like a hibernating squirrel, it's pretty easy to just burn off all your fat in the winter, and you come into spring and you can get back into that other metabolic rate to get through summer. Bears, I think, stay in it, and we're more like a bear, right? And so it's like, all right, so what do we do now? And in my blog, I've talked a lot about so there's a lot of different dietary things that will that will reduce the SCD1. There's herbal things.
Do you have to
think
about
things.
Do you have to think about it from basically two things? How do you switch PPAR gamma to alpha and downregulate SCD1, or does one take care of the other, or how do you think about it?
No, I think they're separate things. I think that that downregulating I think downregulating SCD1 can cut short the cycle of PPAR gamma and SCD1, that kind of like positive feedback loop that's like hosing all of your fat saturation. But just because you've done that doesn't mean that you're immediately gonna crank up your metabolism and start firing off PPAR alpha, because you still have all this stored unsaturated fat. And so I do think that I think that if we can sort of resaturate our body fat long enough, I think that ultimately we can get out of this torpor. But that's kind of, that's what we're trying to figure out, right? Let's see how this works.
Yeah, we have the SCD1 desaturating. Do we have a saturation?
No, there's no saturase. So you can't, once it's unsaturated, It's unsaturated.
So then would a strategy be just really increasing reactive oxygen species as you're going through this unsaturated fat? How do you?
Yeah. So there's different, right. So we can think about all the different ways we could play this, right? One is to eat a bunch of saturated fat to get the blend going into the mitochondria to be more saturated. And that's what I did with the croissant diet. Was the idea is let's eat a bunch of saturated fat, and hope, and maybe we can, overwhelm all of the stored fat that way. And I think that works. It definitely works in the short term, but it's also what I found is that if I'm really, really disciplined about eating that way, it works really well. But then as soon as I kind of fall off the bandwagon a little bit in different ways, I find my body reverts right back to its torpid ways. It's so when I did the croissant diet, I was able to lose, especially abdominal fat really quickly and lost a bunch of weight. But then it's I got busy over the summer and I lost some discipline, and very quickly weight creeps right back on. And so I can see using supplementing with stearic acid in the short term, I think can have these huge impacts on your metabolic rate. And I think people who are highly disciplined, and I'm not going to put myself into that category because I wish I was more disciplined, but that's who I am. It's okay. I accept myself. And so, that's where I'm thinking more long-term about how do I actually change over my body fat. Right. And so, as you probably know, I've had this weird, oil called sterculia oil and imported. It's a tropical tree, and it has this oil. And so a lot of fats actually have something called sterculic acid And sterculic acid happens to be a natural inhibitor of SCD1. And so I think that by consuming this inhibitor of SCD1, we can cut short the runaway cycle of SCD1 and PPAR gamma. And that's good. That allows us to start the process, I think, of, slowly allowing our body fat to resaturate. And the actual dynamics of that system, and like how long does it take, and how fat does fast turnover, like those are things that I don't necessarily have great answers for at this point. I would love better answers, but I'm working on it.
This seems to be the biggest question. I mean, like all this stuff seems to be going in the right direction. I think gives us a little bit more of a path to look down, because like what we've been doing hasn't been working for most people. Like keto works until it doesn't. And then like, okay, why is that? And it actually makes sense given what we talked about, especially in the last podcast. But then now moving forward, it's like there's so many questions that are open here that I'm sure you'll spearhead a lot of interesting things moving forward. But there's essentially the path would be 100% remove linoleic acid sources from diet, increase stearic acid in long chain saturated fatty acids, and also inhibit SCD1 via some of these things like sterculia oil, berberine.
Berberine also does it.
Other things that pu'er tea.
Pu'er tea is an interesting one. It's this like crazy fermented tea that they make in a certain region of China that is pretty good at suppressing it. There's other things, ironically, this is a case in biology where you see a U-shaped curve. Small amounts of polyunsaturated fat will actually suppress SCD1, which is kind of logical, right? Because the body is thinking, okay, we have some polyunsaturated fat coming in. We should turn off this enzyme that's unsaturating, right? Because we don't need it right now. We have a source of polyunsaturated fat. But then too much polyunsaturated fat, and seemingly specifically too much, linoleic acid, then it goes the other way. And now SCD1 gets like massively upregulated if you eat too much linoleic acid. And so,
which again, linoleic acid is found in most foods with fat at some small amounts, like even wild animal foods, 3%, which is normal and probably feeds into this and helps out with this stuff.
Right. Exactly.
And the question then is like you were saying, we were talking about a little bit before the sort of recording today is, okay, well, how long does this take and how do we know? And what are the things? And again, some of the things that I've seen is that, when you incorporate some of these polyunsaturated fatty acids in your phospholipids and throughout your body, fatty acids, et cetera, it takes around 2 years before they get recycled out. But is that an average? Like what cells exactly is that for? Can that be sped up? And going a 2-year long diet, and then if you mess up once, then you're on another 2-year long diet. I mean, it's like this is a really complicated thing, and I want the easiest, cleanest, simplest path for people to be able to take to be able to reverse a lot of these things.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, so so I've got different ideas about it, right? One idea is like, okay, well, if we focus on consuming a lot of really saturated fats to kind of chase out the unsaturated fats while also doing something to suppress SCD1, maybe eating a lot of fat is a good way to like increase fat turnover through the system, right? So if I'm eating a lot of something like, stearic acid or my stearic acid enhanced butter oil or beef suet or something that I know has a lot of saturated fats and not a lot of unsaturated fats, maybe eating a lot of that kind of fat can actually increase the rate of fat turnover. The other thing that I wonder about is like, okay, well, starch eating cultures have very high metabolic rates. I'm like, what if I just ate potatoes while taking sterculia oil? Because that almost totally eliminates the polyunsaturated fat. And then the only fat that I have coming in is what my body could make through de novo lipogenesis. And that's always going to be saturated if you are not producing much SCD1. So that's another alternative approach. And
so
which one's right? I don't know.
Is de novo lipogenesis, does it go steric palmitic and then the SCD1 then turns it into oleic, or how?
Right. And so the first, the end product of de novo lipogenesis is palmitoleic acid, which is a 16 carbon saturated fat. And in order to make oleic acid, you need an elongase, which is something called ELOV-L6. If you want to Google it, is the thing that adds the 2 carbons to palmitic acid to make it into stearic acid. And then SCD1 comes along and convert the stearic acid into oleic acid, which is the 18 carbon monounsaturated fat. And SCD1 can convert palmitic acid directly to palmitoleic acid, which is a 16 carbon monounsaturated fat, but it does it at a much lower rate for whatever reason. It is so you'll never see. Well, I actually have extraordinarily high palmitoleic acid on the that omega quant test that I've been doing. Like my palmitoleic acid level, the first time I did that test was 3%, which is really high. That's higher than anyone else. A bunch of people sent me their results, and no one else was over like 1.5%. So I apparently make a lot of SCD1, which makes sense, because I've always struggled with obesity, as has a lot of people in my family. And so anyway, the ratio of palmitoleic acid to palmitic acid is if anything, maybe more indicative than the ratio of oleic to stearic acid as to how potent or how much SCD1 that you're making. I haven't talked about it a lot because I don't want to confuse people more than I already have, right? It's like, so there's different ways to measure all these things. And anyways, where was I going with this?
So just jump in, a couple of interesting things here. One, you said your family struggle with the same thing. Have you seen any SCD1, this like upregulation, torpor, be passed down with epigenetic factors?
Yeah, so there's one really interesting paper that I talk about in the blog where they took newborn babies and they looked at the desaturase index of the free fatty acids from the cord blood, so the umbilical cord. So they took the umbilical cord from the mothers, and they took the free fatty acids are the fats that circulate in your bloodstream that are basically, those are getting taken straight up by cells and burned as fuel. We have triglycerides and we have phospholipids and free fatty. But anyways, the free fatty acids are basically the fuel. That's like the last step before things are getting burned. And what they showed was that in mothers, independent of blood glucose, even after they corrected for things like blood glucose and blood sugar and insulin and all the other things, the desaturase index of the blood in the umbilical cord of the mother was, directly predicted the BMI of the child. And that at 2 years of age, it still predicted the BMI of the children. So, if the desaturase index in the mother's blood was high, the infants were, overweight when they were born, and at 2 years of age, they were still overweight.
Yeah.
And so
how much has to do with breast milk as well, and them eating the same foods, things like that. But that's interesting. It's very interesting. So we can blame mom for the love handles then. Perfect.
I guess so.
I think another interesting thing that I'd be curious in your hypothesis here, but would that theoretically mean everything we're talking about is that if you had high amounts of unsaturated fats stored in your fat tissue, your adipose tissue, and then fasted for longer periods of time, burning fat, obviously, but would it then actually lead to lower metabolic rates, torpor, increased SCD1, et cetera? And would a better strategy actually be not fasting and consuming, even if it's a lower amount of food, these saturated fats to at least have some ROS production in there to short cycle things, maybe again, sterculia oil or puer, or some of these other down regulators. Like, do we think fasting while having this desaturates index high would be terrible?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one of the things that fasting definitely does do is it increases SCD1 because, which is logical, right? Because if your body is sensing fuel shortage, it's thinking like, oh, the next time we eat, I should, pack away a few extra calories, right? And I think that SCD1 is the mechanism for that. And also, this is another paper that I'm like, I'll probably write it up this week and post it on the blog, but leptin is also really tied in with this whole loop. And so, leptin is made by your fat cells, and it's more or less linear that the more fat you have, the more leptin you're making, right? It's like, it's the body's way. It's like a sensor for, how many calories do we have stored, right? The body knows that just based on the level of leptin. And so what leptin does is it actually increases your metabolic rate. So leptin turns on PPAR alpha, like leptin turns on the fat burning part of your metabolism, and it suppresses SCD1. Like, one of the main things that leptin does is it suppresses SCD1, and insulin actually increases SCD1. So leptin and insulin are in this battle over SCD1. And so, insulin is typically telling your body to store calories, and leptin is telling your body to burn calories. And it all takes place in this kind of fight over controlling the expression level of SCD1. And the problem is, okay, so if I say that the main job, or one of the main jobs of leptin, is to suppress SCD1, and then if I'm obese and if I have a very high desaturase index, then clearly I am leptin resistant, right? Because if I was sensitive to leptin, I wouldn't have a high desaturase index. And so that's, and we know that most Americans are indeed leptin resistant. And I think that's, I think it all ties in.
How much does the desaturase index fall from what you're eating dietarily?
Well, I mean, I think, like I say, I think in many people, the initial increase in SCD1 and therefore desaturase index is triggered by eating too much linoleic acid and too much sugar, right? I think those two things are what initially give you this elevated desaturase index. But then once you're in it, then the question is, okay, how do we get back out of it? And that's what we know. But I had a really good thought about the leptin and the things. I lost the track.
Yeah. If you think about it, come back to it. I have an interesting anecdote for myself. I was super overweight when I was younger. I'd say not anymore, but not as lean as I would like it sometimes. And a couple of years ago, I had toyed around with obviously keto for a very long period of time, bulletproof coffee type of stuff. And it wasn't until I started drinking these coffees every morning that had cacao butter in them. Stopped fasting. And I was like, no, I need to eat in the mornings. And I had cacao butter, decaf coffee, cacao powder, these little ice mochas. And I got like effortlessly lean at that point. And that was before I ever read any of your stuff or knew anything about stearic acid and this whole thing. So it's just like interesting to me, like when I think about fasting alone may actually, especially all the recent work you've been doing, indicate that it's not a good idea for long-term metabolism or fat burning.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think instead, the goal really, I think the goals should be less focused on, calories in. And I think we should be thinking more about calories out, keeping that metabolic rate high. How do we become more leptin sensitive? And like you say, yeah. And it's funny, there's one of the, stories on my blog of people who have done, really well after reading the croissant diet and then trying one of the things was a woman who was doing exactly that. She was using cocoa butter in her coffee in the morning. And and she had been stuck on this long-term weight loss plateau and started with keto and then did carnivore for, I think, 2 years, like really strict carnivore. And then she started, got rid of chicken, got rid of all the polyunsaturated fats, and she started using cocoa butter in her coffee in the morning. And she started to lose weight. And then, for her, it was progressive. I think this is, Emma is the name of the person, or Emmy is the name of the person on my blog, under the testimonials tab, if you want to read her story. But and for her, she lost weight very slowly at first when she started using the cocoa butter and focused on more saturated fats. She said grams per day, I think was her term, and slowly lost weight. And then after 3 months or so, she said the weight loss accelerated, and all of a sudden, she just really lost all this weight and hit, she said she actually went past her kind of target weight and got even, leaner than she had even hoped to. And so that's interesting. And there's this other guy, Dave, whose testimonial is also on there. And he did, exactly what I sort of in theory, I think is right. It doesn't necessarily work for me, but this idea of just eat tons of saturated fat, when he first read my article and he started doing it, he was consuming like 5,000 calories a day. And he kept detailed food records. He had an app and he was tracking everything that he ate. So he's got pretty good records that he was eating like quarts of Haagen-Dazs, just like anything. And he was using the stearic acid, and he was using the stearic acid enhanced butter oil, but he was eating, and I have his like daily, food, logs posted on the article about him. But he said, I was doing 4,500 calories easy, and it was just coming off, the weight was just coming off. And now he's got like a 6-pack, and he did it all through just simply avoidance of, strict avoidance of linoleic acid and increasing stearic acid as much as possible and just cranking the metabolic rate up,
Did he also see it took like a couple months to get in that crazy fat burning mode?
For him, it changed pretty rapidly once he got rid of the linoleic acid and started, cranking the thing. And I think he even has a scale, like a graphing scale. So he actually has he sent me a graph of his weight. I think that was like after he'd already been doing it for a couple of months. And he says he also has 2 or 3 friends that he's like turned on to the same thing, and they've done what he was doing and it's worked for them as well. So, it does work for some people. And I suspect that the difference in the long-term thing is, are you doing all this lipogenesis? Is your SED1 and your PPA or gamma cranked up? Because if you do, then, even if you can have these quick responses to something like consuming a lot of stearic acid, the problem is stearic acid is also rapidly, converted into oleic acid by these enzyme systems. And so it's fleeting, it's hard to hold on to it. You can consume it, but you can also convert it all away if you're in the wrong metabolic state. And so what my suspicion is that, David was not, his metabolism was probably in good shape. Right. And so for him, once he removed the dietary polyunsaturated fat and started eating the stearic acid, it was like, the fuel entering his mitochondria was probably totally cranked up. Whereas, someone like myself, where I see these huge amounts of palmitoleic acid, I'm like, yeah, my body is like rapidly working against me all the time to like convert everything over. And that's probably why I'm struggling more. Right. And so that's kind of the thing. And I think all of this comes down to like, what's nice about this theory, if I'm correct, is that all these different pathways lead together. So I think that, I think leptin, how is it actually doing its job? Well, I think what it's doing is it's turning down SED1. That makes your fat saturated. If your fat's really saturated, it drives ROS production. And if you drive enough ROS production, then you turn on these uncoupling proteins, which is what allows you to do thermogenesis, which is basically like, burning off your calories as heat. And so, right. So the story of ROS and how they induce thermogenesis and turn on this fat burning is very consistent with the stories of leptin and, things like supplementing with stearic acid. It's a consistent picture, which I like, and the shared mechanism. At the end of the day, the mechanism probably is ROS production at the mitochondrial level, which is turning on this fat burning mode.
So interesting. So beyond the stickily oil, what are some of the other things that people can eat or take as supplements or herbs or whatever that you've seen?
Sure.
And is there does stickily oil completely knock out the effects? And do you need SCD1? Is it a bad thing? Should you cycle on and off? Is there anything you should need to take with it?
Sure. Yeah. So first, let's hit on the idea of, okay, what if we completely annihilated SCD1? We probably don't want to do that, mostly because if you completely eliminate SCD1, it does lead to increased inflammation, and that I don't entirely know why that is. It probably has to do with membrane fluidity and these kind of low level things happening like in the endoplasmic reticulum, etc. So I don't think we should aim to completely eliminate SCD1. Although having said that, mice who don't have SCD1, they stay very lean and have a very high metabolic rate. And so that's a I think probably a key point to think about in all this is like, we can show reliably that in a rodent model, if you can't make SCD1, your metabolic rate is jacked and you will stay lean. And this was originally shown, and this is how it all ties back with leptin. This was originally shown in a mouse model where, so we've had mice since like 1949 that don't make leptin. And these mice have a low body temperature, low metabolic rate. They get very obese and they overeat. So it's like the full on metabolic spectrum you see in these mice. And so if all that you do with these mice, of course, we didn't know why they were fat at first. It wasn't until we discovered leptin in like the mid 90s that we understood what was wrong with them. But then it turns out if you take that same mice that can't make leptin and you remove the SCD1 gene, all of a sudden its metabolic rate is just jacked. And so it continues to overeat. It in fact eats even more than regular mice that don't have leptin. But yet it's largely protected from obesity due to the fact that its metabolic rate is just cranked. And so and why is it cranked? Well, it's probably cranked because the fat it's burning is really saturated. That's creating a lot of reactive oxygen species. It's uncoupled, like all of its mitochondria are uncoupled, and it's just doing all this thermogenesis and like burning off this massive amount of food that it's eating as heat, right? And so that's really the beginning of the story of SCD1, and how we found out about it and how we realized its importance was like, oh, for some weird reason, we know that leptin has all of these functions, everything from like control of thermogenesis, control of, satiation, and it's doing all of these things. And for some reason, if you just remove this other gene, you restore like 3/4 of what leptin is doing. And then, later we realized that, it turns out that leptin suppresses SCD1. That's one of its main jobs. And so that's kind of like where all these threads come together or how we found initially is this mouse model with leptin and SCD1 knockout. Anyway, that was a long-winded way of answering your question. Where was I going with this? We talked about.
It's not a good idea to eliminate it for a long time. So like for some of these inhibitors, particularly oil or not, like, do you need to take anything else with them?
Right.
cycle them? Like what are the...
Yeah. So what I found, here's what I think is, I think that you can wind up in right. I think if you like totally knock out SCD1 on day one, what'll happen is you can, with something like circular oil, I think you will shut off that whole cycle. Like I say, this whole cycle with the PPAR gamma and the SCD1. There's a caveat to that, which is that both, like I say, like I think it's better to run your metabolism based off PPAR alpha rather than PPAR gamma. In my new little funny YouTube video, I have, if anybody remembers this old Christmas cartoon, Mother Nature has two kids, and one of them is the cold miser and one of them is the heat miser, and they're like battling over whether there's going to be a green or a white Christmas. And so those are my two characters representing those two enzymes. It's like two different ways of running things. And the thing about PPAR gamma, though, is if you're using PPAR gamma, you are running your metabolism on fat. And so if you completely cut it off without doing something to stimulate PPAR alpha, I think you could, put yourself into I think you could like totally cut it off fat burning as well as fat making. And I think there can be caveats to that. So I would say that it's probably good to do a dual purpose approach where you're like trying to do whatever you can to suppress SCD1, but then trying to turn on this long dormant PPAR alpha at the same time. You know what I mean? Like,
what are the things that do that?
So that's where some of the things like berberine come into play. Berberine does both. So berberine is an herb. It's been used in Chinese medicine for like 4,000 years, and its effects are similar to metformin. Metformin also suppresses SCD1, and so berberine is both suppressing SCD1 and turning on PPAR alpha. So that's one of the things that I talk about is like I've suggested taking the circular oil together with the PPAR, with berberine for exactly that reason. More recently, I've been turned on to something called Astaxanthin, which is a very interesting compound. It's actually the thing that makes salmon pink, or like shrimp or crabs. It gives them that red color. And that is also turns on a lot of these sort of thermogenic genes, things like, there's other CBT1, and it turns on the uncoupling proteins. And that is seemingly, doing a lot, standing in for a lot of leptin. I think of it as okay, well, if I know that I'm not sensitive to leptin, is there anything out there that can replace that function of leptin until I've sort of like resaturated my body fat, is I guess how I would describe my approach to all of this, to see if it's going to work. And like I say, I haven't pulled this off yet, so it's an in progress experiment to see how it works. But
how things change for you personally, incorporating some of these things. I don't know if you're doing the astaxanthin with all the stuff yet, but I'm assuming you're doing the circular oil. And
right now I am doing the sterculia oil, and I'm doing the astaxanthin, and I actually kind of switched from the berberine to the astaxanthin, and I like it. I think, one of the ways I test it is just with my body. I take my body temperature a couple times a day, and like it's usually higher in the afternoon. I've been in the 98s, lower like 98.1, 98.2, which is, historically I would have been like 97.4, you know what I mean? So I'm seeing this kind of slow and steady rise in my body. I've even seen 98.6 a couple of times, which I always get really excited about that. But, what it's supposed to be, right? And so that, that's just a really simple thing that I track. And another thing that you can track, which sounds silly, but, so there's a discussion, the R saturated fat thread on Reddit, and somebody on there said, well, a really simple test of your metabolic rate is just how long can you hold your breath for? Because, if your metabolic rate is high, you burn more oxygen, you can't hold your breath as long. So that's another thing is like, you can take your baseline of like, how long can I hold my breath, and then make some changes, and then, see if that time decreases. I don't know how reliable that is, but it's definitely cheap. Right.
Yeah.
Another thing is just, I'll notice like when I'm doing things that are working, like I think with the astaxanthin, I noticed like, just like, if you can just pay attention to your body and like how hard you're breathing, and like, in the morning, I'm usually thirsty and I'll like chug a pint of water, and I'll notice that if my metabolic rate is high, I can't get through the pint of water without, gasping for air. And some days when I'm not like that, I just drink the whole thing. And so these are like really subtle, hard to really track on any real level, but, sort of like how in tune with your body are you kind of things, right, to track this stuff. So
are you seeing any significant fat loss since you've started to incorporate these things?
So I've gone up and down a bit, and I had gotten on I was taking the stercouli oil for a month and a half, and then I was starting to see change in the right direction. And then I had a month where like I had to drive this truck to Chicago to drop off the Firebrand Meats pork. And then I came back, and it was like my family members' birthdays, and I was traveling, and I was off my schedule. And so then I actually managed to undo the progress that I had made. And now I'm back in my routine, and I'm starting to, I've lost 4 or 5 pounds in the last couple of weeks, and I'm like on the trail again. And I think it's going well, but it's sort of like, I want to say this is like, I'm getting close to, right, the final end of this journey where I can actually get down to my target weight, but we're going to see. I'm
excited to keep staying in touch. What about any other testimonials that you've seen with people who have done the same thing?
Yeah, well, I did. This isn't on the website, but one of the other things that happened when I started using the stercouli oil, which is really interesting, is so I saw like so I've also had really high triglycerides. And when I started taking the stercouli oil, they dropped by like 75%. And I had high LDL, and that went way down. And then somebody just emailed me that they started taking the stercouli oil, and they were working with, a natural doctor, and they had been just struggling with LDL and triglycerides. And the doctor was saying, look, I'm a natural doctor, but if this keeps up, we may think about putting you on statins. And they took it, and their LDL and triglycerides dropped by 30 points each. Wow. And so that has me interested, because I suspect that it's all tied into, the amount of these things being cranked out by the liver. When you look at mice, like there was a study that came out, I think in 2019, where mice given stercouli oil in a high sugar diet were resistant to fatty liver. And so I do think that these enzyme systems are playing a huge role in, right, things like levels of triglycerides and LDL. And I think they all kind of connect on some level. So I think it is going to take some time to get, like, I think that I need to get all of my fat saturated until I see the real long-term results, right? And I don't know how long that's going to take. And so I'm trying to test, and I actually need to get I want to check my desaturated index again to see how that's progressing. But
what would you recommend in that? Every couple of months? Because it can't change that.
I would say it doesn't change that fast. I would say every couple of months.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quarterly, something like that. Yeah. And just see how that's progressing. It's one of the things that was interesting for me was I was taking, like, I kind of did a safety test where I was taking a lot of the stercouli oil because I wanted to see, like, am I going to die? What's the worst that could happen? Right. And there was, I did my inflammation numbers went up, and which I kind of expected them to. And that's why I was testing it and got a background. And I was like, okay, well, don't take that much. I was taking like at times like tablespoons a day, and now I'm recommending like, 1,200 milligrams. Right. And so I was like, okay, don't do that. But what was interesting is on the desaturated index, when I was taking that much for 2 months, my number, which started at 2.1, went all the way down to like 0.7. And then I stopped taking it for 6 weeks, again, just to see what would happen. And at the end of that 6 weeks, my number had dropped almost down. It had gone all the way back down to like 1.9. And the reason I tell that story is that I think that the number that you see in the test is probably a lot more dynamic and changes a lot faster than your underlying adipose tissue. And once you stop doing it fairly quickly, you revert to, your stored fat levels. And so, so that's what I imagine is happening there.
Man, this is really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff, man. I'm super curious to see sort of what comes from this and how you develop more of a program around this. It just seems like an inevitable path and really promising. Yeah.
Thanks, man. I don't know. It's an interesting journey, and I'm hoping that, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I hope that, if we can fix our fat ultimately and get it back to what it should be, we can, fix our metabolism, right? Which is I realize that's a big goal and that's a big thing to say. And for me to say it, obviously I've struggled my whole life with obesity. So if it can work for me, I think it's going to be promising, and we're going to see, and I think, there's a lot of data out there to suggest that perhaps I'm right. I read I've written a bunch of articles on the blog about the body fat, adipose tissue composition of different societies, places like Nigeria and China, where they eat mostly starch. Interestingly, they have very highly saturated fat, and they also tend to have very high metabolic rates. And so that's when I'm seeing I recently did this deep dive into science around metabolic rates, and they were actually worked out in the 19 teens, like 1915. This guy wrote this book in it was a book in 1919, and he had this equation for how you can predict someone's metabolic rate based on their gender, age, height, and weight. Basically, take those 4 numbers, plug them into this index. It tells you how high their metabolism should be, and it turns out that by 1986. And even way before that, the equation stopped working. It was in America, it was overestimating people's metabolic rates by, in some studies as much as 15%, right? And so you see this 15% drop in metabolic rate in America as vegetable oils are introduced. Interestingly, though, if you look even recently in China, in mainland China, there was an article that came out pretty recently, I think it was 2016. And to this day, they don't eat a lot of vegetable oil or sugar in mainland China. So it's still a very starch-based diet. And in China right now, they're saying, well, actually, that old equation under predicts metabolic rate in mainland China by 15%. So you see as much as 15% in either direction based on the amount of the amount of the different fats people are eating, and different cultures, and there's another study that, you mentioned the farming culture in Bolivia, that Tsimane, where they're eating mostly starch, and their body temperatures have dropped in the past, and their metabolic rates. They actually did both. Their body temperatures and their metabolic rates have dropped in the last 15 years. And what's interesting about that is they were getting their temperatures measured regularly by a new, some outpost had gone there. And so there was a medical office and there was a store. And so, it was closely monitored, and they saw a drop in body temperature of, I think it was 1 degree Celsius, which is around 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe it was 1 degree Fahrenheit. And that happened just between 2005 and 2016, something like that. And the only thing that really changed was they had a store where they could buy food. They weren't just eating, I think they were eating cassava root and these other really starchy things as most of their diet. And all of a sudden, you know, store-bought food comes in and probably sugar and vegetable oil. And you see metabolic rates and body temperatures drop. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of anecdotal but interesting evidence from human cultures around the world and historically and how things have changed to suggest. And then you look at the data in mice, and I just think there's a lot of different lines of evidence intersecting that this is important, and it's real. And, you know, now we ask the question of, you know, can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again, I guess.
It's a phenomenal question. I think everybody's in this health space is trying to figure that out, and you're doing phenomenal work. So really appreciate all the stuff you do, Brad. So we talked a lot about, you know, Firebrand meats, the pork that you just got back in stock, the sterculia oil, the stearic acid and butter oil. All the stuff can be found at your website.
Yes. So right? Yeah, the sterculia oil, the stearic acid, and the stearic acid enhanced butter are all at fireinaBottle.net, and the low polyunsaturated pork is at firebrandmeats.com. And people want to follow me on Twitter. I am fire_bottle, and definitely check out the Fire in a Bottle YouTube channel. Search for Brad Describes the French Paradox. And I have this really ridiculous series of videos that I'm doing that I'm very excited about. They're silly. And basically all of the different enzymes are portrayed as these different human characters. And they're in this contrived universe around the mitochondria. So it's a lot of fun. I'm excited.
I'm excited to check it out. I can tell through your writing that you're a super hilarious and creative guy. So I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, thank you for coming on for round 2, and I'm sure we'll have you on again as you seem to be cranking out research and learnings at a ridiculous pace here. So, as always, my friend, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.